Yeah, you all could have dressed up like your endangered species. Kind of maybe a scary costume.
Yeah.
The plover, on the other hand, would be very, very cute. Yeah.
Our partner was like, you should do a costume that's like a crane, construction crane, out of cardboard, and then have like a little stand. The crane on the sand. Yeah.
Abstract.
Yeah.
Deep.
Yeah.
All right, I think we're going to get started. So just a few quick announcements, everyone. So the folks that are doing the Your Water, Your Life project, we're doing midpoint check-ins this week and next week. All that's going on. Next week, November 8th and 9th, is the Water in the West Symposium. That's going to be at CSU Spur in Denver. It's possible I might be able to get 1 or 2 free registrations. I'm still trying to figure that out, but if you're interested in that, just contact me and I'll let you know if I can hook that up. We also are having a group of students where everyone's going down together, so we have some transportation down there too on the 9th. So if you're interested, just talk with me after class. And then Colorado Water Congress just announced a Career Accelerator Award. I put it in the Canvas announcements. It's a 1-year program intended to promote equity and diversity in the water sector. And it includes funding to attend their 2 conferences that they hold every year. Cool opportunity. Again, just look on Canvas and there's a link to learn more about that. Any questions or things before I introduce our speakers for today? Okay, so very exciting. We have 3 speakers today. We're going to learn about key species in the South Platte River Basin, their habitats, and some ongoing restoration efforts. So first I'll start with Amy Ostick. I didn't ask pronunciation. Ostick. Amy Ostick is the chief of the Interstate Federal and Water Information Sector at the Colorado Water Conservation Board. Prior to joining CWCB, Amy was the Assistant Attorney General with the Colorado River subunit at the Colorado Attorney General's Office. Amy attended the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and the University of Colorado Law School. And Kara Scheel is the Endangered Species Recovery Program Manager at the Colorado Conservation Board. She is a professional engineer, earning her BS from the University of Nebraska in Biological Systems Engineering and her MS from Colorado State University in Civil Engineering. Could talk with some of you about that career path. And then finally, we have Matt Reddy, is the regional biologist for Ducks Unlimited. He has worked on wetland and waterfowl conservation in Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska, and the Dakotas for over 30 years. As a regional biologist, he is responsible for the development, funding, and implementation of conservation programs and projects that restore and protect important waterfowl habitats throughout Colorado and the neighboring state. He lives in Fort Collins, Colorado with his wife, son, and daughter. And I'm keeping it short for the interest of time to make sure we have enough time for our speakers. So with that, we're going to bring up Amy and Kara. Make sure I have your stuff here. Okay, and here's a clicker.
Thank you so much. So again, my name is Amy Ostick, and I'm the chief of the Interstate Federal and Water Information Section at the Colorado Water Conservation Board, which is the state's water policy division. And that's kind of a mouthful, but essentially what it means is that the section that I oversee works a lot in our interstate compacts, interstate water agreements, including the recovery implementation programs. So I'm excited to be here with Kara today to talk to you a little bit about the Platte River Recovery Implementation Program. I am,
not screen sharing on Zoom.
Oh, okay.
Sorry about that. I think you have everything and you don't. Okay, there we go.
It's always a challenge every time for me, at least. So yeah, my background is that I am an attorney by training. And a lot of my background has been in the Colorado River Basin. So Platte River work is relatively new to me. And I kind of come at it from a legal policy perspective, which is why it's really great having people like Kara to tell me about all the technical and other more complicated details that we need to be aware of when we're making decisions in the context of the program. So again, we're going to talk a little bit about the Platte River Recovery Implementation Program, but I thought it would be, okay, maybe I need to use the clicker. It seems to be, thank you. Did you just click it?
Should be able to go now.
Okay. I feel like you would think at this point, like I would know how to use these things, but apparently it's still a struggle every time. Okay, cool. So like I said, we're going to talk about the Platte River Recovery Implementation Program. Thought it would be helpful first just to give you a quick overview of the Platte River Basin, and I'm sure a lot of you are relatively familiar with this, but the Platte River has headwaters, of course, in Colorado. The South Platte flows through Denver, picks up the Poudre, flows towards Fort Morgan, Julesburg, and into Nebraska. The North Platte also headwaters in Colorado, just on the other side of Cameron Pass. But the program we're talking about today, it presents some unique challenges because the critical habitats reach, or the associated habitats reach, I always get that wrong, is fully within another state in Nebraska. So that creates some, I would say, unique and interesting challenges in terms of how we manage things among the 3 states that share the river. Okay. So what we're going to cover today is just kind of how the program came to be, what its purposes are and what it does, and then some next steps and future challenges that we foresee in the program. And I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Kara, who's going to talk a little bit about how the program came to be and some of the species. And I think that there are some cute bird photos coming up. Ready for that?
They are the real stars of the show. So we are going to, oh boy, now I'm gonna struggle. All right, so we're gonna step it all the way back to the mid 1800s when historical accounts of the Platte River cited it as a mile wide and an inch deep. So the Platte River through central Nebraska was very wide and shallow. It had a sand bottom, it was braided, and it would get these large snowmelt events that would come through in the spring from the Rocky Mountains that would scour away at the banks and the vegetation and create this vast open space of sandbars. And this was great for the bird species that use the river because they could have a view of any oncoming predators, and the sand could provide great camouflage for their eggs and their young. Now, fast forward to the same river mile on the left of the screen in the 1990s, and things looked a lot different because of the increasing needs from human development and agriculture. There was 15 major dams and almost 7,000 canals constructed upstream of the Central Platte. And as you can imagine, this dramatically changed the flow patterns of the river, which caused it to become a much more narrower and vegetated version of its path south, which it then struggled to still support those habitat needs of the species. And there were 4 species in particular that were at risk of becoming extinct. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service listed them as endangered. And they're shown here. So the whooping crane is the tallest bird in North America. It stands almost 5 feet tall and has a wingspan of 7 feet. It uses the Central Platte on its long journey from the Gulf of Mexico to northern Alberta. And in the 1940s, the population of the whooping cranes was as low as 16 individuals. The interior lease tern uses the Platte River as a nesting and breeding grounds. And it forages on small fish that it can capture in the shallow riverine habitats. The pallid sturgeon resides in the lower Platte and the Missouri rivers and is fondly often referred to as the dinosaur fish because its existence dates back to prehistoric times. This fish is a bottom feeder and it can grow up to 60 inches long and be as much as 85 pounds. A small shark. And then finally, the piping plover, which similar to the least tern also nests on the sandbars of the river. They have eggs that camouflage into sand and they produce these tiny little fuzzy chicks that forage alongside the adults shortly after hatching. This is back to you.
Yeah. So fast forward, I guess, a little bit to the 90s. We were seeing booming development on the Front Range, a lot of new water projects coming online, and a lot of concern about how are we going to manage compliance with the Endangered Species Act. Now, one option to handle that would be individual Section 7 consultations for each of those water projects. But that would be a pretty costly, time-consuming, challenging thing for each individual water user to do. And the other reality is, you know, again, the habitat stretch is in Nebraska. So it kind of set the stage for a collaborative effort among the states and in conjunction with the water users to try to figure out how to make consultation and ESA compliance more streamlined and to provide assistance for the habitat stretch in Nebraska. So that's kind of how the program came to be. And I want to be clear that, you know, you heard Kara talking about what the river used to look like. And, you know, it's not the goal of the program or any of us to try to get the river back to what it was years and years and years ago. I don't think any of us want to give up the Front Range of Colorado. We all like it and live here, the agriculture that relies on the river. So really the effort was to find a way to balance all of those competing needs and not to get the river back to where it originally was, but to manage for development going into the future. So that's how the program came to be. And some of the underlying goals were really to avoid litigation among the states, again, to allow water development to continue and to find a way for all of us to collaborate and work together to make this all work. So ultimately, the three states, Wyoming, Colorado, and Nebraska, came together with the feds, the Department of Interior, Fish and Wildlife Service, and water users. And I'll point one of them out here, Kyle Whitaker with Northern Water. He came to heckle us, so I have to heckle him a little bit. But, you know, water user partners throughout the basin all came together to figure this out. And it took about 10 years to figure it out, so to speak, a decade of negotiations before the program was formed in 2007. So the program has two primary goals. One is related to the species, to help with the recovery of the species and that habitat stretch in Nebraska, but also, again, to allow water development to continue, to allow our water users to get ESA compliance and continue development into the future. And to achieve those goals, the program has a few key elements, and Kara's going to go into these in a little bit more detail. But water, retiming or providing water to that stretch of habitat at times when the species need it the most. Land goals, so habitat lands, again, in Nebraska for these species to use. And all this is done through this adaptive management concept, which Kara will touch on a little bit more.
Okay, so the first element is water. And as Amy mentioned, our overall goal is to be able to retime 120 to 150,000 acre feet of water to that critical habitat reach during specific time periods. And we do this through a portfolio of water projects. Each state at the establishment of the program was expected to help contribute to this overall water goal. So in Colorado, we have a project down on the Tamarack State Wildlife Area that's just west of Julesburg, and that is our groundwater recharge project. So we divert water from the river in times of excess, store it in recharge ponds, and then retime that back to the river, during those key time periods when it's needed downstream. We have a number of other projects, including Lake McConaughey in Nebraska has a large storage pool, if anyone's ever been out to Lake McConaughey, that we use to release water from for the critical habitat. And then we work with irrigation districts and power districts to use some of their water to retime it to the critical habitat reach. And then we even have some leases with some of them. The second element is land. So another program objective is to acquire land interests, and when appropriate, we help to restore this land and then we maintain it and manage it for suitable habitat for this species. Now it's important to mention that all of the land acquisitions done on behalf of the program are on a willing buyer, willing seller basis, but we've almost, we almost have 14,000 acre feet of land throughout central Nebraska that we manage for the program. And we do a number of activities on this lands. We do some vegetation control. We have a lot of issues with invasive Phragmites that constrict our river channel. So we try to clear that. We're clearing trees. We're doing some grading. And then we're even helping the species by protecting for predators. So we put up fencing and other deterrent devices. And then the last element I'm going to touch on today is the program's adaptive management process. So this is a scientific process that's really key to the success of the program. And it is designed to be implemented when a management action or decision needs to be made, but we're not entirely sure of what the outcome of that management action or decision is going to be. So the reality of it is we just don't have all the answers at this time. We're not entirely sure of the things that we're implementing on the ground, how they're going to contribute to our desired outcomes. So, but what we can do is form our best hypothesis based on what we do know and what literature is available, what research is available, what we've already learned. And then we can design some actions or experiments around that, implement them on the ground, monitor them throughout, and evaluate them. Then we do an assessment of that evaluation to determine if that is helping us to meet our goals and adjust that as necessary. And this is a continual cycle that we're doing, and that helps us to continuously improve our management decisions that we're making.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the governance structure for this program and how we make decisions and operate. So the program is kind of managed by a governance committee. It has representatives from each of the 3 states, from Bureau of Reclamation, from the Fish and Wildlife Service, from environmental organizations, and also from water users. I am the state of Colorado's representative on the governance committee, and Mr. Whitaker here is the water user representative from Colorado. You didn't expect to get called out this much, did you? But you know, the reality is that we have a number of committees that really inform our decision making as a governance committee. Kara, I think, might be on all of them. So we have the technical committee, the water committee, the financial committee, and the land committee. So they really do a lot of the hard work and help us make good decisions for the program. The way that the program is set up is in increments. So in 2007, the first 13-year increment started with some key goals. And as we were nearing, I say we, but I was not involved in the program at this time, as we were nearing the end of that first increment, there was a realization that some additional time would be helpful to see if we could identify more water, because we hadn't quite met those water goals, and to do some additional adaptive management and kind of see, well, how are the species responding to more water or to other management decisions, and to help us make some decisions about what was really needed and what might not be. So the next step, presumably, is that in 2032, this first increment extension will be over. We know that. But, you know, there's an open question about what comes next. Presumably, there will be a second increment of the program. There's been a lot of discussion about, you know, maybe it being a maintenance program, continuing the work that we're already doing. And a lot of the reason for that is that we think that this program has been largely pretty successful. It has provided streamlined ESA compliance for 160 projects in Colorado, 217 total, which is really, really important to our water users. The lease turn was delisted in 2021, which is great. And then 506 whooping cranes reported in 2019, which is someone who is sat in a blind late into the evening watching for whooping cranes. That seems like a pretty big deal to me. Seems like a lot. And also the habitat for piping plover has been improved, and we've seen a steady increase in breeding pairs. So we think the program has largely done what it is supposed to do and been pretty effective, and that the experience that we've gained has really helped inform some of the open questions about what we might need and what we might not need to make this a successful program. But we still have some open challenges. And fortunately, to deal with those challenges in the first increment, we have this extension. And within that first increment extension, we have a couple of additional goals that we're working towards. One is trying to find a little bit of additional water. 10 to 20,000 acre feet is what we're looking at, but also just, again, doing the science and adaptive management and trying to understand how do the species react to more water at different times, things like that. We also, one struggle that we have is what we call the choke point, and maybe I'll go, if I can, it's not too far. Sorry, back to this map. So around North Platte in Nebraska, we have an issue of channel capacity, essentially, where because of the flood stage, we can only get so much water through the river. Because of irrigation demands, it's hard to get enough program water through at the times that we need to. So what we're continuing in the first increment extension to look at options for addressing that, or if it is something that can be addressed. So those are some open questions we're dealing with in the first increment extension, but we're also getting ready to look at what the second increment might be. And we're doing that against the backdrop of climate change, reduced flows, Nebraska talking about building a canal, which could really affect our ability as Colorado to meet our program obligations. So there are a lot of interesting challenges to come, but those are the types of things that we're looking forward to working on in the future. So I think that's all we have for you today, unless I missed anything.
Thanks, Karen. I do have some videos if we have like 2 minutes, or if not, we can hold on. Okay.
But one or two questions now, and then we'll open it up for larger questions after we get one of the next speaker. Any questions right now? What's the status on the sturgeon?
Great question. I did not touch on that much in the presentation, and that is because there is a lot unknown about the sturgeon. It's really rare. We're just starting to collect data on that and learn about it. There's a similar recovery program to ours on the Missouri River, and they're able to stop some of those pallid sturgeon into the Missouri River. So right now we're partnering with some researchers at University of Nebraska, and they're trying to track the presence of the pallid sturgeon in the Platte River and see how they're using that habitat. But a lot is just really unknown about how they use the Platte.
Can you give some details how those Nebraska
Yeah. So, part of the way that we meet our program obligations is through, as Kara was talking about, the Tamarack project that retimes flows so that they're, hitting that habitat stretch at the right times. And the Perkins Canal, which is addressed in the 1921 South Platte Compact, would have a senior priority date to the Tamarack operation. So in theory, it could really undermine our ability to retime the flows through Tamarack, which is how we contribute water to the program.
And so would there be lawsuits? Not, right, so essentially, because of the would that throw a wrench, I guess?
Would it throw a wrench? Yes. I think the other thing I'll say is that there are a lot of unknowns about the Perkins Canal and how exactly it would operate. So we're continuing to try to work with Nebraska to get more information about their underlying assumptions about how the canal would operate. So I don't want to, assume that we will be in litigation or anything like that. I think that we have a lot more to talk about. But yeah, I think it's a potential cause for conflict in the future.
One more while I get this other presentation stuff. Go ahead.
A lot of the Colorado water law generally was created way before we had a black center on the ecology and hydrology in these areas. What are some of the ways this program and other programs might like solve that discrepancy? Is that a goal of the project to get Colorado water law up to speed with what's needed to sustain the environment?
I actually think the Platte River Recovery Program and a couple other recovery programs that we're engaged in that Kara works on are really good examples of how we've managed to do exactly that, by essentially working cooperatively with our neighboring states, with the federal government, and working within, the prior appropriation doctrine and state water law to say, look, we're going to find a way for development to continue, for the priority system to remain intact, but also to help these species out. And I think what we found is, not so much an overhaul of water laws needed, but more figuring out how to bring everyone to the table and getting all the resources we need, whether that's funding or, and looking at, I think, creative solutions to water challenges, because it's not always the case that, more water is always going to solve all the problems. I think having a holistic understanding of what the issue is and the various ways it can be addressed is really important.
Thank you. I think I might, if I can, add to the answer of that question, more of a Colorado context outside of the recovery program, is that there are tensions between restoration of river systems and habitats and prior appropriation system. And that really came into play in the last few years as lots of federal resources came on board to do a lot of restoration in places like Colorado in our river systems. It became apparent that it made a lot of water users really uneasy using some of the techniques we use to do that work. I'm not going to talk a lot about them today, but beaver dam analogs, stream restoration techniques, all of these kind of in-channel techniques were being performed without necessarily going through and getting a decreed water right. And so Parks and Wildlife, a bunch of partners, CWCB all got together and said we need to solve this problem because we do not want to go out and try and do this against the water user community generally. We're going to lose against the prior appropriation system. But if we want to take advantage of all the resources made available to do restoration, we have to figure something out. And so recently a bill passed through the legislative body, the General Assembly, allowing small scale stream restoration techniques like beaver dam analogs to move forward and be implemented without necessarily needing a new water right decree. Stuff I'm going to talk about in my talk here generally does need decrees for water, and I'll get into that a bit. So there are ways that we try and just play in those gray areas of the prior appropriation system to meet our restoration objectives generally. Again, I'm Matt Reddy. I'm a regional biologist. I'm a wildlife biologist. I've been working in Colorado for about 3 decades delivering wetland restoration for birds. You guys are getting a big dose of birds today. I do have some pictures of some fish and snakes and stuff, but I don't know a thing about them, so don't ask me any questions. I too have a lot of cute bird pictures interspersed, but this is really what my job is about, is to make sure that we see ducklings produced on a continental scale so that waterfowl populations are sustained in North America. And that's what Ducks Unlimited does. How many of you have heard of Ducks Unlimited? Oh, great, fantastic. So I don't have to read all of this, but we are an about 8-decade-old organization formed by waterfowl hunters back in the 1930s who saw precipitous declines in waterfowl populations and thought that that was because of habitat loss on a continental scale. And so they put together this system of volunteer groups putting on dinners and banquets and stuff and raising money to restore habitats in Canada, Mexico, and the United States. Right now, we have over 600,000 members and we have 4,000 fundraising events a year. And those proceeds go to this habitat work, including here in Colorado. Here's our mission statement. More ducks is what it really means. And over those 80 years, we've conserved more than 16 million acres of waterfowl habitat in those 3 countries. These are canvasback diving duck. They tend to use deeper open water rather than the marshes you may be familiar with. So I'm going to talk about South Platte River, the lower part of the basin. You can get trout unlimited to talk about the South Platte River up in the mountains if you want. But the picture on the left there shows a pretty good example of the South Platte basin where we work. That is a photo out by Weldona, Colorado, up in the far corner. In the way back, you can see the Front Range and the haze. The big water body in the upper right is Jackson Reservoir. And the South Platte River kind of wends its way through all the agricultural fields to a property that we've done some work on the lower part of the photograph. And today I'm going to talk about right here, the riverine habitats. So the habitat associated with the river channel itself. And we just got a good dose of that with the cranes and the plovers and the terns and the sturgeon as well. And then the riparian habitats, those habitats that are associated with the wooded areas, and then the wet meadows and pastures associated with the floodplain of the South Platte Channel. And we also have a system of agricultural and municipal habitats associated with the South Platte River from Denver all the way out to Julesburg. The ag system has a lot of diversions, storage, and conveyance systems that are heavily used by not just waterfowl species, but all the wildlife species in Colorado. And there's a lot of irrigated pasture, hayland, and croplands that provide resources for these birds too. Waterfowl just don't attend to the wetlands in the South Platte River Basin. They also use the ag fields to feed the waste grains in those fields. They're very important food resources, not just for ducks and geese, but for cranes and other species as well. And then, as you all know, the parklands that we use South Platte water to irrigate here in our municipal areas do tend to collect a large amount of Canada geese. And that's important. People get to interact with waterfowl on a daily basis, but also can be a nuisance. And really what's important is the South Platte River provides water, and wetland habitats are really important because they only form about 2% of the landscape in a place like Colorado, but more than 80% of wildlife species utilize these 2% of areas for some part of their life cycle. And so conserving these waters and the lands they run over are very important for a broad range of wildlife species, which I'll run through after you look at this little yellow warbler. And so here's some fish species, and I'm not including all the fish species. The tiles I'm showing you, the pictures here, are pictures of species that Colorado Parks and Wildlife has identified as species of concern. And so these are target species where they spend money doing conservation projects for these species. A lot of minnows exist out on the South Platte in the areas we work. So those bottom three are kind of minnow species, and they tend to be able to survive in the kind of low flow, warm water, low oxygen environments that you see out there. Amphibians and reptiles depend upon these wetland systems. The northern leopard frog, very important species, snakes and turtles as well. We have some mammals that are important. The Peebles meadow jumping mouse is found in the riparian areas up here in the foothill regions. And that's an endangered species. And so it's under a lot of the same compliance regimes that you just heard about for the cranes. And of course, otters and beavers. Beavers especially are really important. They're not necessarily a species of concern, but they do so much in terms of a keystone species in these wetland environments that they're very important economic species for wetland systems. We just heard all about those folks, so no need to. But we also in Colorado have our own cohort of cranes that come through, the sandhill cranes. Last few weeks, you might have heard them if you're walking around. They fly over this time of year and you can hear them. There's thousands of them flying over right now. Lewis's woodpecker is a really cool woodpecker you'll find out in the cottonwood galleries out in these riparian zones out east. And then that owl is a short-eared owl. And they use the big marshes that you find out in those floodplain wetlands to hunt in. And they're a species that's seen a pretty steep decline. So all these species use wetlands and enjoy the habitats that we talked about. But you invited Ducks Unlimited to the talk, and so you're really going to hear about ducks and how we, the kind of the bases for our conservation programs and how we have to take our waterfowl ecology and push it through the prism of water availability in a water short system. And that's really going to be where I go next. You have blue-winged teal, shovelers, all sorts of cool species of ducks out there. And my favorite is the northern pintail. So kind of echoing what was going on with the whooping cranes is Platte River is important because when you think of migratory waterfowl, these are migratory birds, and their conservation happens on a continental scale. The Platte River here in Colorado may breed tens of thousands of birds, but we get millions of birds that are bred up in Alberta and Saskatchewan and Montana and the Western Dakotas. And those millions of birds, attendant with the cranes and everything else, fly down through these pretty set flyways. You have a Pacific flyway, you have a central flyway, the one in the middle that kind of crosses through Colorado in the middle of the country here. You have a Mississippi flyway that follows Mississippi, and then an Atlantic flyway. These are basically big funnels of birds that just, it's their habit to follow these during their big migration events. Again, this is happening right now as we speak with the storm that came through. It's pushing millions of birds out of Canada as Canada freezes up, and they're filtering down into these areas. And the Platte River especially is an extremely important stopover, because you can see the Platte River is one of the few rivers that crosses those migratory routes. And so they're big stopover areas for these birds as they hopscotch down to the Gulf of Mexico and Mexico for their wintering, and then hop back up to get up to the Canadian prairies in the spring. And so that's why Ducks Unlimited as a program, and why the Platte River is Ducks Unlimited's #1 priority for our Colorado program, because of its importance as a stopover for migration events. And we keep close track of these birds. Ducks are some of the most well-studied animals in existence because of their recreational value for waterfowl hunters. We have a long history of counting these birds, and we count them in Colorado and other migration flyway states in the wintertime. So we can get a good handle on what's going on with these flights. And there's a long history I could talk about, but what I really wanted to show you is this graph, which is why we're pretty concerned. Is what this shows is these midwinter counts. And so this is the number of waterfowl counted in the South Platte area of Colorado from 1970 to about 10 years ago. And you can see that we're talking during these counts somewhere in the early mid-20th century, between 150 and 200,000 birds. In the 1980s, there was a big shift of bird numbers downwards to what we're seeing now, between 50 and 100,000. And we know what precipitated that shift approximately is there was a drought up in these Canadian prairie areas. But we've seen that before. That's why you see those big jagged lines. This drought causes duck numbers to fall. That's just natural. What's of concern is why they never came back. Because drought went away in the Canadian prairies in the 1990s. We never got our birds back. And so we are like, what's going on, and what do we need to do to make sure that these birds do come back? That's a deep, long seminar, would take longer than 20 minutes to talk about, but a lot of it plays into the same reason we talked about with these cranes, is that you've seen massive shifts in the types of habitats available to these birds. Now, this happened early in the 20th century, but there's a lot of changes going on in the river itself and the availability of these habitats for waterfowl. And why is that important? Because migration is really physiologically demanding on birds. It's like running a marathon every single day. A mallard burns about 43 kilocalories per bird per hour as it's flying from Alberta down here to Colorado. That's 13 times its base metabolic rate. So it is burning a ton of energy. And so if it's flying from Alberta, it's in good shape, and that whole flock comes down here, settles outside of Brush, Colorado on the river, and there's no food, there's nowhere to land, they're not going to be able to come up with the nutrients they need to put that body fat back on. They're not going to be able to basically eat so that they can make the next flight out. And that's my job as a waterfowl ecologist, is to find ways to restore habitats so that they're available to these birds, not just anytime, but at that specific time in their life cycle when that food needs to be there and made available to these birds so that they can make that complete life cycle. Because if they're not in good condition here, they will die. These birds will just die, or they will move on. Luckily, birds can fly, and that's probably one of the reasons we saw that big drop and never came back, is because they just found other places to go that have the resources they need. And so in water world here in Colorado, we talk about gaps a lot, and you guys have seen graphs of gaps, water gaps, all sorts of gaps, and I'm going to show you another thing of gaps. But one of the things to really get into waterfowl ecology is what this graph shows is you cannot have that bioenergetic gap. If you have a really good water, well, let's first go with the green line. What that shows is the landscape of the South Platte Basin needs to provide so much food to provide energy and nutrients to these birds when they arrive during their fall and spring migrations. And the bottom just shows each month what that demand might be. Demand peaks in Colorado and the South Platte Basin during the winter months because we receive millions of those birds during those months. And then it tails off as they kind of fly back up into Canada. The blue and the yellow lines, what that represents is basically the supply of energy. And that supply of energy and basically the availability of that food absolutely depends upon whether we've had a good water year in the South Platte Basin or not. If you have a really good year, you can see that there is never any time that the green line and the blue line intersect until all the birds are gone up into Canada, and we don't really have a burden to support those populations. If it's a low water year and the wetlands aren't full, they didn't grow any food, there's nothing available for those birds, you can see that very early on in the migration event is you have that intersection of the yellow and the green lines, and we're not giving those birds enough food, and they'll start to cannibalize their own bodies to stay alive, and they'll either move on or they will die. If you get a cold snap like we just had, a winter storm like this is really tough on birds, especially not so much ducks, but the smaller birds we show, they are under the same regime, and it can really put a hurt on them, and we can get mass die-offs. And so my job is to make sure that we never see that intersection of those lines with demand and energy, make sure that gap doesn't exist. And the way I do that is this is my palette where I have to work is this river system. What I'm going to do is walk you through some of the techniques we use in an area like this to make sure that we have all the energy we need on the landscape. A great egret eating something. One of the things I wanted to bring up though is I've listened to some of the previous seminars, and they were always showing these water supply gaps, and this is one of those graphs that comes out of the water plan. And I just wanted to point out that these gap graphs that we show, these don't have any environmental or recreation parts of these bands. These are all the different scenarios that we're projecting out in the future. This is all agricultural and municipal supply needs. Nobody has yet come up with an easy way to show, well, what about the environmental and recreational gap needs in the South Platte River? We have systems and programs, we have water rights, we have those things, but in terms of our planning and our focus on these gaps in these basins, we're not really showing the environmental needs. American avocet, cool bird. So one of the things we could do is just go buy more water and make sure that we have enough water out there. The duck people will go get the money and we'll go spend water. Problem is duck people don't have enough money. When Aurora just says we need more water and Aurora just ups their mill levy a tiny little bit, that's a lot easier than me trying to get all those volunteers here in Colorado to give a little bit more money so we can buy water. Water is way too expensive for just the scope of what we need, that we can just go out and be a player in the water markets. And I know you guys have seen lots of graphs that show the price of water just skyrocketing. A mink eating a northern leopard frog. So what do? Well, sometimes buying water isn't out of our reach, but we very rarely just buy it on the open market, like going out and buying CBT shares. But what we do use is conservation easement acquisitions on the Platte River. What this shows is kind of our focus area on the Platte River. The reddish purple is our state lands open to the public for hunting. The kind of yellowish stuff in between are conservation easements that Ducks Unlimited has purchased or had donated, or one of our partners, Colorado Open Lands or other land trusts out on the river. And what that does is most modern conservation easement deeds, when you encumber those properties, you also encumber water uses onto those properties. And so we're not necessarily purchasing water like on the open market and doing a change of use or anything, but we're saying these are special properties. You can see a lot of them are either on the main channel of the river or surround public areas that have wetland complexes. And what we're saying is just keep the water there the way you're using it. It's usually ag land. And you don't have the ability to take that water and sell it to municipality in perpetuity. A lot of the even more recent easement deeds do allow alternative transfer mechanisms though. And so if they want to lease that water to Aurora or one of the other municipalities like Erie for a few years, they have that ability, but ultimately they have to bring that water back to make sure that the conservation values, especially the water-based conservation values, are maintained. So that's one way we do buy water on the Platte River. Bunch of widgeon. But we also do just kind of hard construction activities, similar to what we were talking about with the cranes earlier. One of the things we do are warm water slough restorations. The river used to be this wide braided channel that we saw the images of earlier. And now it's this restricted in size channel that you can see running through the middle. Those old oxbow scars and channels do receive groundwater supplies that are warmer than the surface waters, and so they stay open longer into the season, and they're very highly sought after for waterfowl habitat, and other species use these as well. The problem is with river dynamic changes, they tend to slowly fill in and convert to uplands, which causes some issues with water rights and well permitting. And so one of the main things, one of our principal techniques we use is just going in and doing warm water slough restoration on the Platte. And this is one we just completed a few weeks ago, started last winter. This isn't really how we recommend it. It's kind of a joke because this guy sunk his excavator here minutes after this shot was taken. But it does show the general technique, and it looks horrible. It looks like we're just blowing this whole thing up. But the point is that these do silt in, and we don't have the flood flows anymore to really scour these channels out. And we need to mechanically remove those silts, such that this warm water slough will stay open, which is very important for thermal cover for lots of birds. And this is just a photo of one that's been restored and is operational for 10 years. And so things look ugly when we're done, but ultimately they'll come back and look like this. Little Sora. One of the major things we do are shallow water wetland enhancements on the Lark South Platte. Again, because the river hydrograph has changed so much, you don't get inundation of these channels and these shallow water basins out on the floodplains like you used to. And those were the areas that produce the most food for bird species. So what we have to do within the framework of prior appropriation and water administration on the river is essentially take ditch water or groundwater and irrigate wetlands in those floodplains. And you can kind of see those series of cells and kind of impoundments on the lower left of the photograph. That's what that is, are some of these shallow water wetlands that we've built by impounding across floodplains, diverting water out of the ditch that you can see running along the toe of the hill there, flooding those up to make them available for waterfowl during the periods that they're here. And that takes some pretty intensive engineering, water control structure. It takes a lot of water rights knowledge. We could again talk about this in depth, how we do this within decreed water rights, but it's a pretty successful program we use, and a lot of waterfowl depend upon this both in fall and spring. And we do this both on public and private lands. This is one we finished building about 3 years ago. This water doesn't get more than about 6 inches deep, because that's the preferred depth for a wide variety of species. Bunch of wood ducks. This is the most interesting one, and we've talked a lot about it. Ducks Unlimited, since I've been around in the mid-90s, has been really involved in a lot of the augmentation pond developments, both for the PRIP program, for private ditch companies, for private landowners. And I'm just going to walk through a case study here. This isn't part of the Tamarack program, but it will suffer the same issues with the Perkins ditch in a couple ways I'll get into here. But essentially, augmentation pond development. You're recharging the alluvial aquifer. And you can see this is a system we built on a cornfield outside of Julesburg. And this is what it looks like now as we converted it back to grass. Augmentation ponds themselves we're not restoring wetlands, we're creating them in uplands. And it's a method of last resort. Colorado has lost 50% of its wetlands. We can't have enough water, time, or money to take that back. And so creating wetlands to function like the wetlands we lost is really what we're getting at with these recharged wetlands, because it's a way that we can find water. I won't belabor it since you guys have heard so much, but this is essentially what's going on at higher river stages in the non-irrigation season when the river is full and we can pull water out of the alluvial aquifer through a pump system, apply it to recharge basins that are located just far distance from the channel and fill those up. And what Ducks Unlimited brought to the picture is before we were along, recharge areas were pits. This isn't wholly true, but they wanted to inject as much water as possible, as quickly as possible, to get it into the alluvial aquifer to get those return flow charts that I think you saw a few weeks ago. What we did was say, well, you can do that, but if you design these to be shallow water impoundments, that the wildlife habitat will be better in these areas that you're applying the water. And it will bring funding to help pay for these systems if you design them such that they will benefit migratory waterfowl. And you know what the result is that the return flows, the accretion back to the channel allows them to pump out of priority. So what's this look like? This is the project. On the right is our engineering design and a map on the left. So this is between Ovid and Julesburg. You can see I-76. So if you've gone past on I-76 towards Julesburg, you've driven right by this Hayborn project. You can see we have a pump gallery at the river that pumps almost a mile up to these recharge impoundments located next to the interstate, where they apply the recharge water. Now the issue, well, I'll get to that in a sec. So we built this. This is a collaborative between Ducks Unlimited, the Lower South Platte Water Conservancy District, and our landowner, Kent Hayborn, and then a bunch of ag producers who farm corn above. And the key is that this provides us the means to develop new wet habitats on an area that we have a conservation easement on. It also allows water to be returned to the South Platte River in time to cover depletions caused by those. You see those center pivots down at the lower right hand of that corner? They were threatened with curtailment of being able to pump, so they were going to get shut down in their ability to use center pivot agriculture there. What this project did is allow them, it provides the return flows to the river such that those ag operators can continue to do the work. We've done projects like this up and down the river. We've done Tamarack. We've done work on Andrew State Wildlife Area. We do it for private and public folks because it is the only way that we can get a reliable supply of water into wetlands of the right types during the right seasons for these massive amounts of birds. And the reason we do it is because they work. And this is a bunch of waterfowl using one of our recharge ponds out east. There's a lot more to it, but you guys saw how complicated water is. Just because we're not getting into all that doesn't mean it's not there. We're just giving you the top layer. And so, yeah, that's, I guess, the end of my conversation. If there's any questions.
What's primarily the composition of the diets of the birds to go out to the higher? Fish and vertebrates, like
it changes seasonally and by species. So I'll just give you again kind of the middle ground here. In early fall, when they're moving in, they have just come off a molt up on their breeding grounds, and so they're focusing on invertebrates and native plant species. As they move into winter and you start to get this cold stuff, the body demands shifts to energy, staying warm, and that's when they'll shift their diet to feeding on waste grains. So corn is just pure carbohydrates. That's why everybody eats it. And so they get really fat eating corn. But a lot of species, like the smaller duck species I showed, can't eat corn. Like a mallard is a big duck and will eat corn like crazy. But some of those smaller ducks, gadwall and teal, don't have the physiology to eat corn. So they'll move off to places south.
I'm still know about this. So this is going to be first. Why does the energy demand for have two? Why is it not primary like them coming south?
So that was just on the South Platte, and most of the birds in the South Platte that we're servicing are mallard populations. and they tend to stay here longer. They're bigger birds. They can withstand the temperatures we have. And so it was just a summary like of an ideal year, and we keep all the mallards in the South Platte Basin. What would it take for the population? We know how many birds that is. We know how much energy they expend in a typical year. But again, taking off from the question we just asked, if that was a blue-winged teal, kind of, it would be bimodal. And often for mallards, it would be bimodal too. And the curves of those graphs are shifting as climate is changing too, such that we no longer get the deep cold snaps that we used to 20, 30 years ago on the Platte River. We still get them occasionally. And so those curves that used to apply for us in the 90s and early aughts are now the curves that folks up in the Southern Dakotas and Wyoming have to pay attention to, because that's where the birds are landing now for that season. And so there's this, just, you have to keep your eye on the ball. Yeah.
Try to connect those to the mainstem rivers so that the bird gets some fish to go back and forth and the flows are up.
It depends. It's a great answer. It's a great question, but the answer is it depends. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. Sometimes it depends on water administration and permitting. But in situations where we can provide refugia for those minnow species, because those warm water sloughs do tend to be refugia for them, we will connect. Other times it doesn't make sense because you'll get invasives coming in, invasive species. I didn't show all the trash fish that are in the South Platte River, but they can get into these systems too. And these little minnows are fine, but if you get a load of carp into warm water slough, they tend to churn up the sediment, and that turbidity decreases the availability of plant food for all the other species that use those warm water sloughs. And so it just depends.
Opening it up to questions for Amy and Kara too. Go ahead.
With our drinking ponds, we take no water of the moon, and then the whole tank of water, and the augmentation pond reach the river again over time. Is there an injury to the river due to evaporated loss from this pond?
There is, but that's taken into account by attorneys and others when they go through court. So there's real water, wet water, which is what I'm primarily concerned about. But when you develop an augmentation plan, you have to take it through court, and that gives everybody a chance to come in and stipulate about what the ET rate should be considered, because different plants have different ET rates, different positions in the landscape, and so all that is kind of determined in a court case. I'm really generalizing here, but yeah, and so it's not in our operation of the systems. It's when the decree is established, adjudicating.
For Amy, with climate change going forward, for both of you, what are some of the challenges that you see going forward, and all of us are aware of places where we could be thinking, programs or tools?
Well, I just mentioned climate change changes the whole system. And we put conservation response down in perpetuity, thinking about the system and stay the same, and the hazards of things move. So that, and just the physical fact is that we're getting more floods. And when you put in hard infrastructure, when we're trying to give these birds what they need through putting in hard infrastructure, and we get flood after flood, it becomes very expensive. And so looking at water, looking at engineering, looking at kind of resilient engineering systems rather than some of the stuff from centuries gone by is really important, because you have to put in systems that are cheap, that work, and that can handle a broad range of environmental conditions. I don't know if that was too vague with job advice.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, a lot of my work with Colorado River Basin and I've been wanting to renegotiate the guidelines for operating policies, and we're thinking a lot about, yeah, I mean, how do you create rules, operational rules that are designed to operate in broadly like all of this? Because, you know, I mean, we're going to see probably a lot of dry years, but we're also going to see some wet years that we need to be prepared for as well. And just a broad range of yeah, flexibility so that we can adapt to whatever comes.
Any other questions?
Politically, enforcement of things like the that you speak about, is there also that potential for tweaking the strength of the agency today and enforcement of some regulations or basis? And some of that was part of whatever it's called, the Flat River Recovery Implementation Program. Did those kinds of things, like, I know that they were important on getting pushed through in the first place and had to be addressed. It seems like, but nowadays with not just climate change, but it's political change, how much of a huge question is that for all of you?
I mean, I think with them, I mean, in my ideal world, water should be affordable. You know, I mean, and I think we've seen that happen, you know, operate well in some situations where you've seen changes in administration and haven't seen huge shakeup on how, you know, river is managed. So I would really hope that we can find a way to get back to that. I mean, I think about like the level of engagement that I had 3 years ago on Colorado River competition, but was pretty low because people just weren't, you know, I mean, Colorado River is a big deal, but people just weren't really plugging into it, and administration would come in and say, oh, looks like things are, you know, you guys come on to figure it out, and that's really shifted. And we have seen, I think, in a lot of cases, people coming in and not really understanding what, you know, they want, you know, what's best, just having a whole bunch of money and throwing it at a problem, but not really targeting it on what's really needed. And so, I hope that we can find a way to de-politicize water again, because I think it's in all of our best interest to do that. We'll do the science-based approach to all of it, but I don't know if that'll happen.
We're in a really heated political environment, as you said. But I think day to day, as I work day to day, that there's just this strong current of collaboration, Colorado especially, where we work with agricultural folks, municipalities, all working together. And it never really gets that, like, you can't make something work. We're all facing the same issues. And with that realization, we can all use common solutions. And so, yeah, it's going to get political, but I think when it comes down to it, people will work together as we have been.
Okay, with that, let's end on some really cute little bird videos and have a great Halloween. Let's give a round of applause for Stephen. Oh my gosh. Very cute. Okay, I got one more for you. He's like, okay, I'm full now. Oh my gosh. He's like, I can't even walk now. Thank you. It looks like the other one didn't work.
Oh, okay.
So, all right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great Halloween.
Thanks a lot. Great job.